Welcome to Planet Vero Radio, produced in the Idea Garden Advertising Studios in Vero Beach. Now, the story of liberty with John Bona.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Right? Against that? No! We will run! And we will live. Aye? Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Good evening and welcome to the Story of Liberty. Of course, that's a clip from Braveheart. And this evening, I'm John Bona. This evening we have Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. Welcome, guys.
Good evening.
Great to be with you, John.
Good to be with you, Marshall. Well, you know, just like Scotland, as that clip is from, Braveheart, you know, nations are crying out for freedom, including America. We're looking for ways to bring prosperity and liberty back to our land. And, you know, the fact is we read, you know, in the paper, we hear on the radio, the news, most nations are facing tremendous problems. Individuals, families, business. We read about nations crumbling or on the verge of crumbling. Pressures mounting on every aspect of society. And so the question is, how do we hold up under such pressure? Where do we look for the answers to these many problems, these difficult situations that we face? The Bible, the Holy Scriptures provide the answers the world seeks. See, the truth contained in the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, provides mankind with the principles of liberty. And that's why we call this the story of liberty, because that is the only source that brings real freedom to individuals and nations that are oppressed. Now, the Bible actually teaches, and I know, Marshall, you're a historian for over 30 years. History confirms as well, to the degree that a nation applies the principles from the Holy Scriptures to all aspects of society, is the degree to which that nation obtains freedom, prosperity, liberty. In other words, we reap what we sow, the cause and effect. And I think that's what we need to say, and clearly that these principles, and we're going to talk about some of these tonight, that are contained in the Bible encompass all of life. Now, that includes divine matters between God and man, also social and civil matters, politics. And just as the truth will set men free, and they will act upon it, so it is to set nations free that abide by it. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's one of the first things we're going to talk about. For a nation or a society to stand up under pressure, it must have a strong foundation. Now, that means that each component of a society that makes up the society must have a strong foundation. Now, Marshall, I know you knew Francis Schaeffer, who, the great theologian, and he talked a lot about the individual, the family, the church, the government. And he said that with a weak base, it could only stand when the pressure on it is not too great. And he gave many examples of this. But the pressures that people in America right now is facing are so great that unless they're supported by a solid foundation, the only foundation, true foundation, is found in the Bible, it's going to be very difficult to survive. For our nation to be free and prosperous and a long-lasting nation. Now, as this relates to our Constitution, for example, our Constitution really will only survive as long as it lives in the hearts and minds of we the people. This whole concept of preservation of the fundamentals is critical to support a free, just, and prosperous nation of liberty. And I know, Dan, you understand this concept, this principle very well. What are your thoughts on this?
You know, John and Marshall, this leads me to a story, a college called New College, Oxford. And at New College, Oxford, there is what's called a Great Hall. And in this Great Hall, they inaugurate the new presidents, they initiate the new students. So it's like a cornerstone of the college. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, someone was inspecting the building, and they found that the beetles that live in England had eaten away at the beams, the great beams that hold up the ceiling. These beams are 18 by 18 inches, 20 foot long, solid oak. And, of course, they reported this to the, shall we say, the board, and the board was told they had to replace the beams. And the pragmatic answer was just to go get some glue-laminated beams, cover them in oak, and they'll look the same. Well, you don't do that in Oxford. Oxford's an institution with deep, long-standing truths, and they said, well, we must find oak beams. Well, a chuckle from the group, where would you find an oak tree like this? And, of course, that was the problem. So they were puzzled. They called the gardener in, the man that takes care of all these multiple grounds that Oxford has, many pieces of land all over England. And he said, gentlemen, follow me. And he led him out to a piece of property out in the middle of nowhere. And here standing were gigantic oak trees, huge oak trees, more than big enough to cut the beams. And he said, gentlemen, 500 years ago when we built the college, we knew one day the beetles would eat the beams. And so we planted trees. And for 500 years, generation to generation, we've protected these trees in preparation for the day you would ask us the question, where are we going to get the oaks to build the beams? The vision for America has got to be a long-term vision. It's got to be generation by generation preparing the next generation for a time such as this when they would be called to duty. And that's really the story of getting it in our hearts. We do not do things for today's event, even though we have many things to do today, but we have to have a vision that's long-term. And so we are planting trees in preparation for the day that they'll be called up and needed for a purpose to hold up the institution. And I think that's a real message to people today in every sphere of life.
That's a great analogy, Dan. Thank you for that. Marshall, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I think that this tells us that the foundation is everything. In fact, the Scripture says, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Our great problem today is that we have a myopic perspective because of our modern media and our modern educational system that no longer teaches things in a cosmic context. What I mean by that is seeing the big picture, not the little picture. Right now we're facing over $14 trillion worth of debt and a debt limit and a crisis this month. How did this come about, and what is this all about? Most Americans don't know. All they know is that they want to get lower gas prices, and they want to make sure the dollar doesn't explode and be worth nothing, so somehow the government's got to fix it. So most Americans, because we've not been taught, and this is especially true of the Congress, a long-term perspective, a foundational perspective, why does our economy fall apart when we go in debt? If we don't know the fundamental answer to that, if we don't go back to the long-term everlasting principles that build civilization, then what we end up doing is making short-term fixes, and we make bad decisions. It's like what one historian said, the greatest historian of the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee, said that most historians and most people see the world as a U-boat captain sees the world from his periscope. They just look out of a periscope and they can see one thing, but they can't see everything around them. And that's our problem. We must get this big perspective. From this big perspective, we understand, like you said, that nations that walk according to the eternal principles of right, as George Washington said, or the principles upon which the entire world is built, both physical principles, moral principles, economic principles, governmental principles, those nations are blessed. Of the top 25 nations in the world, one in-depth survey analysis of this showed that 24 of the 25 top nations in the world, for human rights, for prosperity, freedom, etc., the foundations of those nations were Christian nations. And there are 180, or how many nations there are now? There's like 200 nations in the world. The top 24, the top 25, and the only exception to that is Japan. And Japan, of course, was defeated in World War II and took the biblical principles of economics and the biblical principles of a republic and applied them to their nation, and to that extent they have been blessed. But the point is that it is obvious in history, if we go back and simply study the facts, that there's only one group of set of principles or beliefs or laws that brings liberty and justice and freedom, and all other philosophies and ultimately other religions, because all nations are built, as Coleridge said, all nations fundamentally are built upon religious faith and religious belief, because those are the things that people die for. And if you have a certain belief, you're going to have a certain result. And in a biblically based society like America, built upon the Pilgrim Fathers and those that came from the Reformation, the result was they had the system of government, the free enterprise system, all that it took to build a nation that would be blessed.
You know, that's right. And, you know, when I think of the word government, I usually think, and I think most people do, of civil government, because in most nations, that's what the government is. You know, and in a general sense, government, you know, means direction and regulation, some degree of control, obviously, and restraint, you know, of evildoers is what it's supposed to do. But it seems very obvious, and I think a lot of people know this, that the spheres of government can be divided into internal and external government. And another name that we always hear in the Christian areas, that internal government is really self-government. And we hear this a lot, that it begins internally in the heart of man, with his ability to govern his own conscience, his will, character, his thoughts, his ideas, his motives, you know, the level of conviction, his attitudes, and how a man governs himself affects his external actions, his speech, his conduct, even his use of property, for example.